Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. We're getting started with jQuery this week. We spent a couple weeks on Git and GitHub and learning all of that. And Git and GitHub aren't going away. Right? These are tools that we are using for the remainder of the semester, and we will be using them in perpetuity. We'll be using them today, right, as we're doing our demonstrations and such. But we are moving on in terms of module content to a brand new one. This one's on jQuery. And jQuery, as I kind of mentioned in our live stream announcement today, is about... jQuery is a framework, right? We'll talk about what a framework is here in just a few minutes. But, for those of you who have had, a lot of the other classes before, Web, CTI 110, Web 115, Web 215, JavaScript in general is kind of difficult, right? It's kind of challenging. That's one of the criticisms, actually, of JavaScript, is that it's hard, right? It's difficult, just because there's so much to it. And so there are a lot of different frameworks and there are a lot of different things that people have built to try to make JavaScript a little bit friendlier, a little bit more approachable, a little bit easier for us to use. And one of those tools is jQuery. And jQuery is probably, or at least it was, one of the most popular jQuery or JavaScript frameworks in the entire world. Now, the popularity of jQuery has waned a bit. There aren't as many new sites being built today that utilize jQuery. But if we look at, say, Wappleizer, which is an application that we can use to see which types of tools different websites are using, we can see the big sites that are still using jQuery, and we can see numbers and different types of sites that are using jQuery. Right? We see some big sites here. Fiverr.com, CSS Tricks, which some of you might be familiar with, GitLab, GitBootstrap. Bootstrap's still using jQuery, which we'll be talking about Bootstrap in the next module. Dribble, which is a portfolio website. Dropbox.com. And if we looked at a report, we can see that there are a ton of websites that still utilize jQuery, even though, right, over 5 million websites still utilize jQuery. So even though jQuery might be on the decline in terms of its use, it is still it's still very much widely used, and it is a good kind of starter website to, or starter framework, I should say, to kind of get used to when it comes to working with a JavaScript framework. We do use some other JavaScript frameworks in some other classes. We'll do some React in another class. We'll do a little bit of P5.js in another class. Right, but to kind of get us started with a tool that we can use that's still very much widely used, that helps make tree traversal, manipulation, JavaScript in general a whole lot easier. We can use jQuery. So what exactly is jQuery and what exactly is a framework? Well, jQuery is found on jQuery.com. We can have a look at that in just a few minutes. What all we can find on that website. But when we're talking about a framework, we're just talking about a huge collection of predefined JavaScript objects and methods that are basically free to use and just link to and use in our projects. Right, so it's basically a bunch of code that other people have written, that have taken like common things that people do in JavaScript a lot, and it's simplified it, broken it down, making it a ton easier to kind of deal with and implement and use in our sites. There are other things that we can use with jQuery. It also has a mobile library and a CSS library. We won't be worrying about those things in this course, right? But those are options for us as well. Now, jQuery does work on the document object model, and the document object model is a big thing that we've been kind of talking about since the beginning of time, or at least the beginning of the program here, right? Like we start out talking about the DOM, or the document object model, in CTI 110. And it really doesn't leave our side until we're done with the program. Right? The document object model, or DOM, really is something that we discuss in basically every single class. And so since jQuery is just another layer built on top of JavaScript, and JavaScript is just a way that we build and control and manipulate the DOM, kind of going back to understanding the DOM as we are talking about jQuery becomes important again, right? So just as a reminder, since many of you have heard all of this before, the document object model, or DOM, is just a programming API for HTML and XML documents that defines a logical structure for a way that a document can be accessed and manipulated. So when we look at it, it's basically a tree-like structure. And when we talk about it basically in the relation to a family tree. Right? Because items at the top of the tree, there are ancestors. The oldest ancestor at the top of the tree is the root of the document itself, which we either call the document or the HTML tag. And as we break things down further, right, we get into examples like the one that you're seeing here, where you have a table, and inside of that table you have nested rows, and inside of those nested row tags you might have TR tags, and inside of those nested TR tags you might have nested TD tags, and inside of those nested TD tags you have text. Right, we just have this tree structure that's built. Right, so we have to be able to pinpoint and pick out particular elements that are a part of this structure. And so JavaScript, and by proxy jQuery, allows us to traverse the DOM, which means that we are allowed to move through the DOM, and then find or select elements in HTML based on their relationship to other elements. And we can do that using the parental or ancestral relationships that we talk about in the DOM, right? Child selectors, things of that nature. Or we can use things like our selector classes and IDs that we've talked about in previous classes, right? IDs and element selectors and class selectors and all these sorts of things, right? So they all give us different sorts of abilities to be able to work with the DOM, work with different HTML elements, and figure things out. So you can make one selection and then move through that selection until you reach the elements that you desire. And then you can perform any changes that you need to make at that point. So an ancestor is a parent, or a grandparent, or a great-grandparent, and so on and so forth. A descendant is a child, or a grandchild, a great-grandchild, and so on. And so these siblings share the same parent. They're on the same level, right? When we think about that family tree. So when we think about these relationships and we think about selecting different things, right, these are things that we need to remember. And so I'm kind of glossing over all of this at this point because these are things that we've kind of discussed in detail in previous classes. So I don't really want to cover it as much here now, right? But it is important, right, that we kind of understand this and we understand these terms. And so I'm not going to read all this. I'm just going to kind of leave it on the screen for just a second. I'll even go full screen here just so you can kind of read this out and just see the different relationships that we might have here. But it's just another example of the ancestry that's created within the DOM. All right, so we'll just leave this on the screen for a second here, because these relationships are important for us to understand. Or these kinds of relationships are important for us to understand as we're getting ready to work with jQuery. All right. So I'm in VS Code here. We're going to switch back over to the PowerPoint presentation in just a moment, but I want to get us a project started. Because we're going to do a bit of a project this week. Right now, I don't have a project opened up. I'm going to create the project from scratch. I am in my root directory. If we look down here at my terminal, I am in my root directory for my Web140 Fall 2022 folder. So I can just make a folder here, make dir jQuery week 1. And you know what I'll go ahead and do is I'll go ahead and initiate get in here as well, right? We can go ahead and get init right in here and let it initiate get. Actually, I didn't necessarily want to do that. I wanted to cd inside of jQuery week 1 before I did that, and then initiate get in there. But it's okay. We'll be fine. Now we're good. We can go into our Visual Studio Code now and open up that folder. So we'll open our folder. We'll go now, just navigate to that folder really quickly on my drive. That's Web140, Fall 2022. And here it is. We'll create our index.html here, index.html. We'll go ahead and hit our exclamation point here for Emmet to build out our website. We'll change this title to jQuery Part 1. Give that a save. And this week we are going to be working with a JavaScript file instead of a style sheet. So we're going to include a script.js file. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. So now we have some files here that we can work with, which means hey, we've got a commit we can make, right? So if we open our terminal back up, we can get add period get commit -m initial commit, and we have a commit that's been made here. Now, next week, we're going to do a more involved jQuery example. We're going to build a website that's going to have a bunch more jQuery in it. But this week, I just want to kind of get us started and just do something really, really simple. Now, one of the key things that we need to know before we use jQuery is how to include it in our project. Because if we just start using jQuery, our browser won't know what we're talking about. Right? We've said before that jQuery is based on code that somebody else has written, that's not just JavaScript. Somebody else wrote it and they put it into a framework that we're able to use. So we need to be able to put jQuery on our page in order for it to work. Now, we have two ways to do that. One is to download the file completely. That's the first way that we see here. Download the file completely, add a pair of script tags to our code, script src equals jQuery.js. Make sure it's in the same project file as, or project folder as all of our other files, and close the script tag. So it has to be in the same directory when we're doing that. Now, if we do that, that means that somebody who's visiting our site has to download this entire JavaScript file from our site in order to be able to run the jQuery that we've written on our site. Because remember, our browser by default does not understand jQuery. We need to give it the language that it needs to understand it. And that's this inclusion. So what we need to do is reference the online page, which gives us a version through the CDN. And the version that we see here is very old. In order for us to do that, we would rather go to the jQuery.com website, which is here. Right, so the only version of jQuery that's active now is version 3. .6.1. Big orange button right here on the home page. I can click that. That'll take me to another page. From here, I can scroll down. I can read all of these instructions. I can see some different ways of doing some installations here. Right, like since I have Node installed on this machine, I can use npm to install it. Right, I can npm install jQuery. And it will download the package for me. But you know, that's a little excessive, right? Like there's a lot going on there. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to get those out of that project. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep scrolling down this page until I find this section right here, using jQuery with a CDN. CDN, Content Delivery Network. And so there are a lot of big advantages with using jQuery with a CDN. Right? The biggest one is that most sites use jQuery with a CDN. So since most sites use jQuery with a CDN, it's highly likely that they already have the file downloaded on their machine somewhere, cached away. So we can actually just click the link here or visit code.jquery.com, get the version that we want. I'm going to click on the minified version here, copy this code to my clipboard, and I'm going to paste it at the bottom of the body of my site, right there. So now I have included jQuery in this site. Now the only thing that, we can put jQuery here in the body, at the bottom of the body. We can also put it at the bottom of the head. Either place works great. The only thing that I would recommend, just for kind of ease of working with it, is you want to put the link to your script file where you write your code after it. Right? So if you put it in the head, put your script file in the body. If you put it in the body, put your script file after it in the body. So we'll put script src equals script.js and let it close it there. So now we're ready for some code. Right, which is pretty cool. We're ready to write some jQuery now. Right, we've added our reference to our jQuery file here via the CDN from code.jquery.com. We have our link to our JavaScript file now. So all we need is some elements that we can use in the DOM of our website that we can make some changes on. With JavaScript or jQuery. So you know what? This is a pretty good place to make a commit. Right? So let's get add period get commit -m added jQuery CDN. Good. All right. So now what we might want to do is just talk a little bit about kind of how jQuery works. Right, so we need something in our HTML, we need something in our DOM, right, because it's based on our DOM. And JavaScript in general is an event-driven language, right, so it needs some sort of event to happen. Whether that is a page loading, whether that is the window moving, whether that is a click, whether that is a hover, regardless of what that is, it needs some sort of event to happen. And then some code happens. So in this instance, we make a reference to some sort of code. What we have here in yellow, we have a paragraph, we have a div, we have a button. In our jQuery here, we're specifically referencing the div. Right? It's easy to select things in jQuery. Right? We can look at a more specific example here. Right, we can put a reference to an ID. And do some stuff to it. Instead of having to document.getElement by ID, so on and so forth. So let's just write some code. Let's just spend some time writing some code here. We're going to spend a lot of time writing code next week as well. Right, just because that's kind of what's important here. And another thing that's going to be important to all of you is just kind of learning how to take advantage of our jQuery documentation. So if we go to jQuery.com, we can look at our API documentation, and we can look and we can kind of see everything that we need to do. Or that we can do, I should say. And one of the first things that we might want to see here maybe is the function. Right, so let's find our function. And we're just going to look for the basic function call. And they might not really have anything for a function call in the documentation. Because the great thing about jQuery being, and they don't, the great thing about jQuery being just another layer on top of JavaScript is that you can still write JavaScript here, right? Anything that we can do in JavaScript, we can also do with jQuery. We can just do more with jQuery. So let's just do a little simple example here today. And we'll do some more complex stuff next week and talk a little bit more about it. But let's just start out by maybe taking the body of our website and giving it a background color. And we're just going to do it from our JavaScript here. So whenever we want to do anything in jQuery, we're going to start out with our initial event. Right? There's an initial event that occurs to load our jQuery. So it's the first thing that happens, and that is our ready event. So when our document is ready, everything else will run. So we're going to start out with $, and parentheses, and then we're going to include the word document. Document.ready. And then when our document is ready, we will run the function. Right, and our function here is just like a function in regular JavaScript. So this is some code that we start out with just every single time. Right, so we have a selector. In this instance, we're selecting the document. If we were to write this in plain JavaScript, it would be like writing document dot it would be the it would be the event listener for page load, right? So now we have a function that we're going to run when the page loads. So if we wanted to select the body, we're going to start out with a $. And we're going to put our selector in here for what we're going to select, body. If we want to impact our CSS, we can look at our API documentation here. If we search for CSS, we see that there's a bunch of things here that match for CSS, but we do have one particular CSS function that we can use, which is our .css, and it allows us to apply a lot of CSS rules to basically anything. And so not only does it allow me to apply a CSS rule to something, but it allows me to read the current value of a CSS rule, which is what we see here. Right? So in this instance, what we're seeing is we're selecting a div, .click function, variable color equals this meaning whichever div was clicked, we're going to get the CSS for that background color. And then the result is going to be to tell you which color was clicked. Right? So if we click red here, it's going to tell us the RGB value of that color. Right? So in our instance here, what we're doing is we are selecting the body. We're going to add our .css here. We're going to impact the background -color property, comma, let's give it just a color for the time being. Let's make it blue. And we'll save that. Right, so now when our page loads, it's going to load our jQuery. It's going to load our script. It should make the background blue. So let's open this with a live server and see what we get. We get a blue background. Right, if we were doing this same thing in vanilla JavaScript, just to kind of show how this would look in vanilla JavaScript, we would do the following. Right, it actually wouldn't look much different. Document dot add event listener load We could also make this as a function instead of just writing the function directly into here. So let's comment this one out. We'll comment our jQuery version one out, and we'll see this one work. And it might not work. That might not be right. I might need event here. Is that good? Yeah, so that right there should give you some indication of which one of these is easier to use. And it might be window.load instead of, there we go, window.load. So that should give you some indication of what is easier to use, document.load or jQuery, right? Roughly the same amount of code, but when we look at this, our jQuery one here looks a lot more like English than our regular old CSS one here looks. Looks right. So this would be so our document.ready here looks just looks more like English, right, than what we have elsewhere. So let's do another example here. Let's add ourselves a little bit of mouse over text in here. Just going to paste that right in there. And you know what? I think I might just want to add a little bit of CSS to this, just so we can make it look a little bit different. So let's just add a little CSS in here. And we'll link our CSS in here as well. Link rel equals style sheet. Type equals text/CSS. href equals style.css. Now let's look at what we have with our site here. And let's make sure we have everything saved. So now we have this, right? We can add our resetting code here, just for our purposes. And so I want to change some stuff about this box that's here in the middle now. Right, we're able to set a background color really easily, right? Super easy to go in and just make one CSS rule. But, what if we want to do some different events? What if we want to add some stuff here? What if we want to do some other stuff with it? Well, that's also super easy. Right, so let us have a look at how we can maybe add some stuff to this box here. We have this hover over box. And one of the things that we learned about the hover over box, or a hover in general, is that a hover is two events. Hover is an enter, and a hover is a leave. So we actually need two functions that are associated with a hover. So here in my jQuery, I still need to be inside of this ready function, right? Because this is still stuff that I'm going to do when I'm ready. But whenever my example box gets hovered over, which has this ID of example on it, I want to be able to do some other stuff to it. So the first thing is $, and make our selection. So in this case, our selection is going to be hashtag example. And so we're making our example here in the same way that we would make our example in the CSS. Right? Our ID is example, so it's going to be hashtag example. .hover. So whenever our hover is, or whenever our example box is hovered over, we are going to run the following functions, right? So we have two functions. We'll run one at a time. There's one function, and we will comma separate that value with another function. Our first function is for when the mouse enters. Our second function is for when the mouse leaves, right? Because a hover is not just one action. A hover is more than one action. Mouse enter, mouse leave. And so if we want to do anything to this, to the item itself, to the item that we're hovering over, we can refer to this. Right? So whenever we are hovering over example here, I can refer to this, and that means this. So this here means this item that we are hovering over here. So we can change the CSS for this. So .css, background color, green, maybe, right? We can make it green. And that's one thing that we can do. And if we want to change it back, in our second function here, we can run a this .css background color whatever color we pasted into our style sheet here, which is magenta FF00FF. FF00FF. Right, so now if we look at our website, we see by default nothing changes. If we hover over, it changes to green. We leave back out, it changes back. Now what's interesting here is I can actually write more than one CSS rule inside of here. But when I write more than one CSS rule, I have to change up the way that I write my CSS rules a little bit. When I write one CSS rule, I can just put my property and my value separated by comma. When I write more than one CSS rule, I need to put some curly braces in here. I need to add a colon between my property and my value. And I need to add commas between each of my rules. So I could also add a text-decoration underline here. Which if we did that there, we would want to add its corresponding member, or its reversion here, which would be text-decoration none. Right, so now when we look at that here and we hover over it, we get that little underline there. Now you might be wondering, why is the underline black instead of white? And it's because of the way that we have the text nested in our CSS here. Right, we have example, and we are applying this text decoration underline to here, but we have no color here, but the color's on the paragraph. So if we put a color white here, that should fix that. Which we see there. Right, we're kind of jumping back and forth between different files here, so hopefully you can try to keep up. Now, one thing that's interesting is I can use complex CSS selectors to select children. Right, so for those of you who are in Web 2.15, yesterday we talked about the direct descendant selector. So we can actually use those in my jQuery. So one of the things that I might want to do here is maybe change the text inside of that paragraph. So maybe I could write $, and in this case I want to focus that example box, but I want to say the direct child of that, the direct paragraph child of that example box, and I want to change the dot text of that. And I want to make that something like, oh, you're hovering on me. Right? And so now whenever I hover on that box, it'll change the text. Now, obviously, when I'm not hovering on it anymore, I want an accompanying thing to go there to say, you're not hovering on me, or something else, right? So we can just use the same thing again that's on our mouse exit here. Example greater than P dot text. Do it again. So now we see when we hover over there, you're hovering on me. When we're off, it says do it again. Hover over me, you're hovering on me, do it again. Right, and this code here is way simpler than it would be if we were trying to do it all with vanilla JavaScript. Right, the big thing here that we can note is that this reads a lot like English. Right, we can just say CSS, and start writing some CSS rules. We don't have to write multiple CSS rules on multiple lines or anything like that, right? We can just write multiple CSS rules in one item. If we were doing multiple things in one, we can chain it, which is interesting, which is an example that we'll do next week. But we are doing this for a couple weeks, so we'll go ahead and stop here today. We'll stop a little bit early, just to kind of give you all some time to take this in. Let's close by just getting this ready to send to GitHub. So let us open up GitHub here on my other monitor, create a new Web 140 Fa22 jQuery part 1. So we will git add period, git commit, final -m, finalized example. We will add our origin, which is there, and we will get push origin master. There it is on our site. And we'll go over and we'll make it live in GitHub Pages by saving a deployment from the branch master so you can all see that. So that's all that I have for you for today. I'll hang out in the chat for a couple minutes just in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.